Okay.
All right, then I guess we can do it. Let's get started. Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Peace Action of Staten Island's forum tonight, Staten Island for Justice in Palestine and Israel. Special thanks to our board members, Debbie and Dave Polshek, for organizing this forum tonight. And thank you, Debbie, for agreeing to be our moderator this evening. Welcome to our panelists, Roxanne Mustafa, Amneya Hagasi, and Ellen Isaacs. Tonight, we will be discussing the history and present conditions in the Gaza Strip, West Bank, and Israel. Our intent is to have a thoughtful and open-minded discussion on what will bring peace and justice to Palestine and Israel. And we look forward to your participation in this forum. And before I turn things over to Debbie, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. First, I want to officially thank our new board who took office this month. We look forward to another exciting year of planning and working for peace on Staten Island. Also on August 8th, Peace Action of Staten Island, in collaboration with the Social Justice Committee of the Unitarian Church of Staten Island, will commemorate the 76th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. And stay tuned for more details. I also wanted to mention that we have our board meetings every third Wednesday of the month, usually at 7 p.m., and anyone is welcome to attend. So if you'd like to get to know us better, get to know more about Peace Action, please just drop us an email. We would love to have you there. So with that said, I am going to turn the floor over to Debbie Polshek.
This forum was initially planned in May as in response to the board members of Peace Action were very concerned about the bombing of civilians in Gaza and in Israel. And we wanted to have a discussion about how peace could be achieved in Palestine and Israel. In the United States, many of us in Peace Action have participated in demonstrations against racial inequality and police brutality, specifically after the murder of Eric Garner on Staten Island. During those demonstrations, many of us chanted, "No justice, no peace." In this forum, we wanted to hear voices that wanted to discuss that issue. How can we achieve a just society for Palestinians and Israelis? For without justice and equality, there can be no future peace. As a reflection of that theme, we invited members of the Staten Island community who are actively concerned to speak about this issue. Roxanne Mustafa and Amneya Hagasi. Amneya Hagasi, sorry. We invited Ellen Isaacs, a physician and a member of Jewish Voice for Peace. We reached out to J Street for another speaker to add to this dialogue. Unfortunately, they didn't respond. Peace Action knows that there are many voices in the Staten Island community with many different opinions: Arabs, Palestinians, Muslims, Israelis, and religious and secular Jews. We hope this forum will inspire others to continue a dialogue about this issue with these diverse groups. But tonight we hope to begin to discuss this important issue with respect and courtesy for the views of all the participants that are here. Forum participants are welcome to enter their questions and statements into the Zoom chat. After our panelists finish speaking, chat moderators will ask individual participants to ask their question or make their statement. So is Roxanne here, Sally? No? Okay, so I thought then maybe we could start with Amneya. I just want to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker will be Amneya Hagasi, and she's a singer and songwriter and an organizer with the Answer Coalition. She's the daughter of an Egyptian Muslim father and an Italian Catholic mother. She grew up in Staten Island. In addition to commercially releasing music as a solo artist, she is also one half of the local soul pop duo Hagazi with her twin sister. She has presented podcasts about the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Naya.
Okay, let's do this. All right, guys. Good evening, everybody. Let me just change my view here. Okay. So I'm gonna try to give just some very brief historical context. A lot of things have happened in the past couple of months, in the past couple of weeks, and are continuing to happen. So I want to keep the history brief, but it is impossible to talk about this, especially the Palestinian struggle, without talking about how the state of Israel was created. This is referred to as Palestinians as the Nakba, which translates roughly to catastrophe, and it refers to the destruction of over 500 Palestinian villages, the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians from their lands by Zionist militias in 1948. And today, there are 7.4 million Palestinian refugees as a result of this crisis, many of whom live in diaspora, but also 1.5 million who still live in refugee camps in neighboring countries like Lebanon and Jordan. 13,000 Palestinians, including women and children, were systematically executed in 34 separate massacres in 1947 and 1948. And afraid that they would suffer the same fate, many Palestinians in neighboring towns fled from their villages. They left thinking that it would be temporary, with every intention of returning. But in 1950, the first Israeli government passed the Absentees Property Law, which stipulated that Palestinian refugees expelled after November 29th, 1947, no longer had rights to their properties, which were then confiscated by the government and given to Jewish settlers, many of whom were refugees from the Holocaust. Many Palestinians were displaced again in 1967, when Israel first occupied the West Bank and Gaza. But meanwhile, Israel encourages Jewish people from all around the world to move to Palestine, giving them automatic citizenship while denying Palestinians basic human rights. Israel has been a settler colonialist project from its inception, not unlike the United States, who is its biggest bankroller. So again, I'd like to discuss more the current reality on the ground in occupied Palestine, because this Nakba, this catastrophe, did not end in 1948, nor in 1967, but it continues today with the full support of the United States and our taxpayer dollars. So I'm going to start with a very short video from an East Jerusalem neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah, which is, it's really just outside the old city. Just to give you a good idea of what has been going on. Just excuse me one moment while I share my screen. Okay. I'll make this full screen for you.
We take house after house. All this area will be a Jewish neighborhood. We are not finished the job. We are going to the next neighborhood, and after that we will go more. Our dream that all East Jerusalem will be like West Jerusalem, Jewish capital of Israel. אני רואה בזה המשך של המפעל היהודי-ציוני, המשך שיבת ציון, זה הכל, זה בא על חשבון הערבים, כן, גם בג"ץ והכנסת בנויים על חשבון ערבים, וגם המדינה כאן הוקמה, כן, על חשבון חלק מהתושבים הערבים שגרו פה. וזהו. We take house after.
Okay. All right. So that says a lot. I personally really appreciate this guy's honesty about the colonialist history of the state of Israel and the ambitions to continue this history. And in the year 2009, when this video was filmed as part of a larger documentary, 67 Palestinians were kicked out of their homes in that neighborhood. So recently, this is really what's been causing the recent tensions. The Israeli district court ruled that 13 of the 28 Palestinian families living in Sheikh Jarrah will be evicted. despite having lived in these homes for pretty much generations since the 1950s. While many of these settlement groups, like the one in the video, are behind this, they're based in Israel and are funded by the Israeli government, it's important to know that many of them also have headquarters right here in the United States, right here in our city of New York. And the goal, like he said, is to kick every Palestinian out of their homes, house by house, in order to consolidate Jewish control over the neighborhood and ultimately to unite all of Jerusalem under Jewish control. So how can he do this? This sounds crazy, right? This is kind of how it's been going down. Israeli settlers have been forcibly entering and essentially squatting in Palestinian homes in Sheikh Jarrah, and the Israeli military protects them, even escorting the Palestinians out of their homes. The housing courts will most likely rule in favor of the Jewish settlers, despite these families having lived in these homes, like I said, for generations. And the Israeli courts, it's important to understand that they really have no authority in East Jerusalem at all, seeing as it is actually Palestinian territory under international law. But it doesn't matter because Israeli settlers have been illegally occupying it for many years now. I mean, of course, Palestinians in this neighborhood aren't taking the illegal seizure of their properties lying down. Residents have peacefully protested for years while consistently being met with brutality by Israeli police, who arbitrarily arrest them, break into their homes in the middle of the night, disperse crowds with skunk water, which is apparently a new form of weaponized sewage water. It gets stuck to your clothes, and days later you can't get the smell off. It could lead to nausea. It could lead to vomiting. It's essentially a form of torture. We're still waiting to see how the Israeli Supreme Court rules as far as the families who were given these eviction orders. But in all honesty, we really already know, because the Israeli legal system has always served to uphold Jewish supremacy in Israel and to facilitate the slow ethnic cleansing of Palestine. I mean, the system was built this way since 1948. It's also important to kind of question the language here. The word eviction implies that the Zionist settlement groups are the landlords of these properties, which they aren't. Again, East Jerusalem is Palestinian territory under international law, and Israeli courts actually don't have jurisdiction there at all. So in another neighborhood in East Jerusalem, only 5 kilometers away, called Silwan, another settlement group is attempting to evict 100 families under the pretext that Jews lived there 100 years ago. Since 2015, 14 families have already been evicted there, and 81 families numbering 436 people still have eviction cases pending in Israeli housing courts. So recently, 500 residents got paper notices commanding them to demolish their own homes within 21 days, or the Israeli government will come and do it for them. And they actually will have to pay their own demolition fees on top of all of this, which is insane. So Amnesty International and many other human rights groups, including Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, are calling on Israel to stop the demolitions and the evictions in all of East Jerusalem, the 2 neighborhoods I described. And not to mention, if Palestinians are denied permits to build homes on 80% of state land already, which is clear institutional housing discrimination. So a recent report by Human Rights Watch found, it's 213 pages, it's quite long, that Israel meets multiple conditions for apartheid. And it's important to note that only one of these conditions must be met to qualify, but Israel meets all of them. So let's define apartheid. Apartheid is defined as systematic and institutionally entrenched domination and repression by one racial group over another through inhumane acts. So some of these inhumane acts can be arbitrary arrest, like we discussed, illegal imprisonment of the members of a racial group, measures designed to divide the population along racial lines, separate reserves of money and ghettos for the members of a racial group, forcible transfer, that one's ringing really true, expropriation of landed property, and denial of the right to leave and return to their country. as well as the denial of the right to a nationality, to a country. So that's a lot, and Israel meets all of these conditions. So, of course, where there is oppression, there is resistance. So we should now probably talk about the taboo topic of Palestinian resistance. Because inevitably, when one tries to call out Israel for its human rights abuses, the response from a lot of folks, including American politicians, is usually, but Hamas. Let's talk about it. So Hamas is pretty much the boogeyman in mainstream media, and it's labeled a terrorist organization, while the everyday state-sanctioned violence committed by Israel against Palestinians is somehow more legitimate and morally acceptable, simply because a US-funded military regime is doing it. So this didn't start with Hamas. Hamas was founded in 1987, and Palestinians have been executed, dispossessed, and have faced discrimination by Israel since the state's founding in 1948. Hamas is simply a byproduct of Israeli occupation. Expecting Palestinians to be perfect victims and to not fight back is asking them to live under oppression quietly. It's also worth noting that Hamas rockets are crude rockets that really can't be targeted, hence why they are indiscriminate. It's simply what they have because they don't get $3.8 billion a year in military aid from the US like Israel does, only whatever the Iranian government will spare. So on the topic of resistance, Resolution 3314 of the General Assembly of the United Nations affirms the right to self-determination, freedom, and independence, particularly for people under colonial and racist regimes or other forms of alien domination. This was updated in 1982 to remove all doubt that militant resistance is legal under international law when it stated the legitimacy of the struggles of peoples for independence, territorial integrity, and liberation from colonial and foreign domination and foreign occupation by all available means, this is a direct quote, including armed struggle. So it's not like the dozens of UN resolutions on Israel, asking Israel to comply with international law have worked. If that were the case, the West Bank wouldn't be occupied, East Jerusalem wouldn't be occupied. So asking for, again, we come back to no justice, no peace. Asking for peace without justice is asking Palestinians to submit to their oppression and to agree to live under apartheid, which they will never do, nor should they. They've protested peacefully, as I mentioned, for decades, while being met with brute force. And peaceful protesting, while always a very valid form of struggle, is not what got Israel to back out of the Gaza Strip in 2005. The Palestinian resistance made it such a headache for Israelis to keep illegally occupying Gaza that they decided it wasn't worth it and dismantled the settlements there. So essentially, the Palestinian resistance won in Gaza, which is why Israel punishes the people there with a stifling blockade that doesn't allow basic necessities in and out. And Palestinians there only get about 4 hours of electricity per day, all of which Israel controls and can punitively take away at any time. 97% of the water there is undrinkable. So Gaza has endured collective punishment for refusing to live under occupation. And in the most recent war, Israel targeted hospitals, schools, and even press buildings, such as the Al Jazeera headquarters, which is a war crime. And under blockade, Palestinians in Gaza really can't rebuild because supplies such as concrete and wood, they can't get in and out. So there are essentially buildings in Gaza that have been reduced to rubble since Israeli airstrikes in 2014 and 2008. So the situation there, needless to say, is incredibly dire. Back to Hamas. So Hamas, who won the Gaza elections in 2005, threatened Israel for weeks that if it removes the families in Sheikh Jarrah, that there will be consequences. So after Israeli police stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the holiest site for Muslims in all of Jerusalem, injuring 600 worshipers in total in just 1 week, Hamas issued another warning to Israel to stop the attacks on the mosque. The way that I would describe this off the record is just if you imagine being in church on Sunday on a holiday like Easter and the military storms in shooting rubber bullets at you. and stun grenades. This is what happened, and it happened multiple times, injuring 600 people in 1 week. So after Israel continued to ruthlessly fire rubber bullets and stun grenades at worshippers in their holiest place at the holiest time of the year, which is the month of Ramadan for Muslims, Hamas retaliated and sent rockets into Israel, which is, of course, when mainstream media started covering what's going on, predictably, as if Palestinians shooting rockets is just how this started. So since the 11-day war in Gaza, 257 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli airstrikes. The original count has gone up because people have died from wounds and other complications even after the war has ended. 70 children in Palestine were killed. In Gaza, while 13 Israelis, including 2 children, have been killed. The corporate media called the recent events clashes and confrontations. And President Joe Biden, I believe, spinelessly echoed this statement, asked the sentiment, asking both sides to de-escalate. So it's this kind of both-sidism that masks Israel's apartheid against Palestinians, making it sound like a conflict between 2 sovereign nations, which it is not. Palestinians do not have an army. But when you consider that the Israeli military, again, gets $3.8 billion a year from the US, and Palestinians worshiping in their holiest mosque had to throw rocks at Israeli soldiers to defend themselves, the power imbalance becomes quite clear. So I'm going to share a slide real quick. Well, actually, let me share it in a minute. I'll share it in a minute. I want to talk about the way forward. We'll pull up this map right now so we could see what the current map of Palestine, of Israel, looks like. So here we go. Hold on. Let's see. Sorry, way too many tabs open, as usual. All right. So here's the current map of Israel and Palestine. You could see this is where we started in 1947. This is what happened after the UN partition. And pretty much from 1949 to 1967, right, the West Bank and Gaza get smaller and smaller. And today, you can see what's left of the West Bank. It is quite small. All of this white that has kind of come into the green land here, those are Israeli settlements that are illegal under international law. So where do we go from here? What is the way forward in this case? I think it's pretty clear based on the map. And this is potentially a controversial view, that a separate Palestinian state has become quite geographically impossible due to continued illegal settlements and home thefts. So, and even if a 2-state solution, like the one that we saw in 1967 with Gaza at the bottom and the West Bank on the top, were to be viable, were to be pursued, and all Israeli settlements, illegal settlements in Palestinian territories like the West Bank were dismantled, Palestinians would be left with 22% of their lands. And when you consider that, again, 7.5 million Palestinian refugees who still exist as a result of this ongoing Nakba that started in 48, this isn't what justice looks like, if I'm being honest. It's not even adequate space for all these people. And mind you, Hamas conceded to the 2-state solution in 2017 in their most recent charter. But Israel has refused to halt illegal settlements and land grabs. And it's also worth noting that the new Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, has said that a 2-state solution would, direct quote, bring disaster on the Jewish state, and that he wants the world to understand that a Palestinian state means no Israeli state. It's important to note the Israeli government has become increasingly right-wing and overtly racist in recent years. What Bennett represents is just the non-Orthodox religious right becoming mainstream, whereas Netanyahu, the previous prime minister who was just ousted, represents the secular right wing. Other folks may get into this more, but it's a big misconception that Zionism is inherently religious. Theodore Herzl, the father of Zionism, was very secular. And the first prime minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, listed himself as an atheist on the 1960 census. And his next 5 successors were also secular Jews. So secular Jews have actually held most of the power in the government up until the current prime minister. This is really the most religious prime minister we have seen. He's a practicing Jew who wears a kippah. And I mean, so we all know that Netanyahu wasn't really a champion of the Palestinians. He was very unapologetic about settlement building in the West Bank and making it clear that Israel, this is a direct quote, is a land for the Jewish people, simply put. But he would give lip service to the idea of a two-state solution to appease the United States, while Naftali Bennett will not pretend to support a two-state solution. And in my opinion, maybe it's a good thing, because the Israeli government will just be more honest about what it's actually doing and has been doing all along. So this is not a policy change in any way. This is just a new, more religious face of Israeli apartheid. So back to the logistics of this, of how to solve this conflict, right? Nonetheless, we are pretty much left with the one-state solution based on the map. This idea has become more popular in the Palestinian struggle. And in my opinion, it really is the only eventual way forward, even if it won't happen under this next government. Palestinians, so here's the issue, and this is where the dialogue often stops. So if Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza become citizens of Israel and refugees are able to return, Israel loses its Jewish majority, right? The question is, was it ever a good idea to engineer a religious majority of any kind in a country? Is it possible to do so without ethno-supremacy and institutional racism? I believe the answer to this question is no. Others may disagree. I also believe that we need to let go of this very racist, caricaturish notion of Arabs. What I often hear is, well, if Arabs became equal citizens, you know, we would just throw the Jewish people into the sea. And that's not historically accurate. That's not what happened in South Africa after apartheid was dismantled there. It's not what happened when Black people won their freedom in the United States. And it's not what would happen in Palestine or Israel or whatever the new state ends up being called. Israel cannot keep Palestinians under permanent occupation forever. Though opinion polls of the Israeli public show that Israeli citizens favor this, unfortunately, because it is a system that they benefit from. So, in conclusion, what can we do, right? Us, the citizens of the United States, well-meaning people who are here on a Wednesday night at 7:30 to talk about peace and justice. What can we do? What we can do is we can uplift Palestinian voices while normalizing the push for a free Palestine and making it less taboo. It has been taboo for very long. I think the veil is lifting here. Very recently, it's become more mainstream for politicians to say free Palestine, but it is still seen as controversial, and that has to end. Palestinians are asking us to continue sharing their stories on social media because it is truly helping to raise awareness and to apply international pressure on Israel. Civilian journalism has also been so important in helping these stories to reach our eyes and our ears around the world. So I'm going to share with you a slide just of sources that I really want you guys to screenshot this, because I really want you to follow all of these sources to get the narrative, I guess, to shift the narrative, to see the things that you won't see in mainstream media. So all of these sources are Palestinian sources, anti-Zionist Jewish sources, such as Jewish Voice for Peace. We'll hear from another speaker later on who's from Jewish Voice for Peace, and they do really great work to, you know, kind of combat Zionism and kind of break the ties with Zionism in the Jewish community that allow for Palestinians to be oppressed. You know, settler colonialism is a racist ideology, and there's a lot of really great Jews leading the fight against this racist ideology. So please screenshot this, take a picture with your phone if you don't know how to do that. I've also included some books to read that I hope you guys check out. These are really, really great books, and you'll learn a lot about this. I think in a way, we all kind of need to become experts on this topic so that we can educate everyone in our lives, and hopefully we can normalize the push for a free Palestine. I can take a picture and put it in the chat if anyone didn't get that. Oh yeah, and please share this on social media. Please share the stories of Palestinians on social media. You can support the BDS movement to boycott Israel. It's in order to isolate Israel economically. This was a very effective tactic used to isolate South Africa during apartheid and pressure it to end apartheid. It worked, which is why activists are trying to do it in the Palestinian struggle as well. We all learn from each other, right? That's what solidarity is. And lastly, please take to the streets. There are many protests that have been happening in Palestine itself, in Israel itself, and also all around the world, including here in New York City. You know, we have so many actions going on. So please take to the streets, because it's really only through international solidarity and re-education that we can really free Palestine from the river to the sea, see a free land for everyone, for all people. And that's my time for today. Yes, I will put it in the chat, absolutely.
Over there. Oh, I am unmuted. Okay. Our next speaker, I'm so happy that she's here, is can you give me the sorry.
You're looking for your speech.
Yeah.
Your note.
I know. Our next speaker is Roxanne Mustafa. She's a Palestinian-American who lives on Staten Island. She's a product designer, a user researcher, and technology consultant. And she leverages her skills in research, facilitation, and consulting, as well as her work in diversity and inclusion in the technology sector, to apply to her work as an organizer and human rights advocate. As the co-founder and director of Staten Island Women Who March, she has helped to build her community and raise the voice of women and other targeted groups on Staten Island. She has recently been elected to provide a voice to parents on Staten Island as a member of the Community Education Council, which acts as an advisory board to the Chancellor of the New York City Department of Education. She hopes that her discussion of this issue will raise the awareness and understanding of the Palestinian human rights cause in the United States. So, Roxanne?
Hi, everyone. I just want to make sure that you can hear me okay. Can you hear me? Great. I apologize for being so late. Thank you so much to everyone for inviting me to speak on Palestine and for raising this platform, and to the speakers. I just caught the majority, I hope, of Omnia's speakers of our conversation. There was so much there that I hope that everyone was able to tune into. I was going to touch on some of these things, but she said it so eloquently. Rather, I'm going to focus on a couple of other things. I am coming to you from the perspective of a Palestinian American. What does it mean to be a Palestinian American? I encourage you all to look at the readings and the scholarship of Edward Said. He, when I was growing up, spoke so eloquently about this dichotomy that I live in, which is the freedom and the opportunity that America affords me while watching from a distance what my family goes through overseas. And I want to talk to you about that dichotomy. But first, let's talk about why we are here in this forum. Some of the impetus of this forum is the recent events. And we all probably feel like there's a sense of conclusion, that there is a sort of a call to not have arms, and a sort of a peace treaty, if you will. There's all sorts of terms for what's happening right now between Gaza and Israel, but this is not real. It's not sustainable. What's happened in the news in the last few weeks is what's been happening for decades now. And right now what we have is just a lull in our news cycle, while our brothers and sisters in Israel, in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in the diaspora that is the Palestinian diaspora, we are just all experiencing a lull in the trials and the human rights catastrophe that is there. And that human rights catastrophe, we are all responsible for. So let's talk about the people that this human rights catastrophe affects. We can talk about probably 5 distinct groups of people that this human rights catastrophe affects. Number one, this human rights catastrophe called Palestine affects Israelis. Now, I'm using the term Israeli as like the broad swath of Israel, and Israelis are a diverse group. There are secular people, there are Arab Israelis, there are Jewish Israelis, there are Zionists. This human rights catastrophe affects all of them. That's one group. Now, let me talk about the targeted groups that this catastrophe affects. That is actually from least affected to most affected. The least affected of these targeted groups are people like me, people who are product of the refugee crisis that are able to prosper in other lands. Yet we cannot go home, or we cannot go to the land of our ancestors. Today, someone asked me at work, what is a value that you hold as a person and as a designer? And I said that I hold responsible ancestry as a value because I not only want to pass on my heritage and my work in my professional life to my children going forward, but I also can look back. And Palestinians, as most indigenous cultures, can look back so many generations. We can name, my middle name is my father's name, then my grandfather's name, and the lineage goes back 7 generations. This human rights catastrophe affects me. I can't go back to the homeland of my ancestry. I have no rights there. And if I'm lucky enough to be one of those Palestinians that doesn't have Palestine on my passport, then it means I could travel in Israel and watch my family not be able to travel freely in Israel. So it affects me. It affects me because I can't talk to my children about Palestine without having looks of some sort of being anti-Semitic or accusations being thrown at me. I can only talk about the safe things like food. And even food has become a contentious thing because our food is now being hijacked as Israeli and not Palestinian. Our tabbouleh, our maklouba, our falafel. Yes, there's Palestinian falafel, there's Greek falafel, and there's Lebanese falafel, but it is not Israeli falafel. It is falafel to indigenous. Nothing is safe anymore. It's a source of contention, and I will be called an anti-Semite if I say things the wrong way. So I am the least affected of the targeted groups of the human rights catastrophe known as Palestine. The next affected targeted group is the people of Israel that are Arab Israelis, formerly Palestinian. So Palestinian Arabs and Palestinian Jews that are living in Israel and citizens of Israel are not first, second, third, or fourth class citizens of Israel. They do not have the same rights that Israeli Jews, in quote, have. And even this idea of Israeli Jewness is constantly debated by the state. The idea of identity and religion validity is debated and argued and validated by the state. This is a dangerous system for any democracy-loving, Western-loving, human rights-loving advocate. So this is a dangerous situation that Israel has set up, now not just for its citizens, but also for its adopted citizens of Arabs and Jews that were originally Palestinian. The next targeted group of the human rights catastrophe of Palestine are the people of the West Bank, which is where my family is from. Now, there's different gradations there, again, of how targeted and affected those people are. There are people who live in towns like Ramallah that have some kind of autonomy. And then there are people that live in towns like my family. One side of my family is from a small village called Kufr Malik that lives alongside of a settlement called Ofra. Those folks that live in these settlements are constantly infringing upon the land and the rights of the Palestinian people that have been there. Again, my grandfather's been there, my great-grandfather, my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, generations back. What happens to those folks that live within proximity of the settlement is that their land got taken away by eminent domain, or Israel's version of eminent domain, to then advertise to people in other countries, because again, these were not folks that were from Israel asked to come to live in these settlements. These are Jews and aspiring Israelis that come from other countries, and they were told to live there as settler colonists. Now, my family's town of Kufr Malik has shrunk, just like the map that was shown previous. But this village has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk because the wall that the settlements build keeps growing into their land. And for Israel, it's nothing to build up a settlement and then to tear down a Palestinian town. It's nothing. It's as fast as a building can come up in New York City, because there's money, there's political will, and there's the resolution to continue to occupy West Bank land. So who's affected? The people that are affected are people like where my family's from, which is the West Bank. It means that you don't really ever have rights to your home, your land. Schools can be wiped out in an instant, and you're always living in a constant state of threat and stress. What do you think that generations of this threat and stress has done? We are all students of the trauma that Black Americans have been enduring for centuries in this country. This is still happening to this day in Palestine and in the West Bank. The next targeted group, and probably the most targeted group of all, is the people of Gaza. The people of Gaza are in a limbo state, and Israel has a chokehold on this limbo state and is not letting go. The land is opportunistic and strategic, just like the Golan Heights were in Gaza, yet it is a convenient open-air prison for Israel to keep the upstart of the terrorists in Gaza. When we talk about Palestine and Gaza and the rockets that are flown and the tunnels that Israel says are being used to supply arms, I always hear the arguments from my American friends about everyone deserves to live in freedom and everyone deserves to live in peace, but Hamas, but Hamas, but Hamas. Hamas is a small yet organizing body in Gaza, just like one of our political parties or a smaller political party does not represent all of us here in the United States of America. Hamas does not represent the entire Palestinian situation. It represents a group that believes in its inherent right to self-defense. So the rockets that are thrown are never seen as an offensive attack by Hamas. They are seen as a defensive maneuver of the people in Gaza that they believe that they are governing. And also, they believe that it's constant resistance to occupation and colonialism and imperialism. Now, sometimes it even goes far back to imperialism, because remember, that region was never really left alone by the West. That region is just historically, religiously, constantly in flux. But for the Palestinian people, and again, let's remember, the Palestinian people comprise of Arabs, Jews, and Christians. A lot less Jews, because most of them are living in Israel proper now. A lot less Christians, because a lot of them had the privilege to be able to leave as refugees and start life somewhere else. But a lot of the Muslims are still in the occupied territories. So these are the people that are affected by this human catastrophe called Palestine. What do we do about it? That's the question, right? The question is, what do we do about it? I could talk about the two-state solution and the one-state solution all day long. I think these are political solutions to a moral dilemma. And one of the things I really want to highlight is this is not a religious conflict. So let's not pretend that religion can solve this. A lot of times when you talk to folks that believe, Jewish folks especially, that believe in the land of Israel, their timeline starts during biblical times, where Palestinian timelines start in historical times, meaning recorded history, meaning times of Jesus, usually around the times of Jesus. Everything depends on where we start, right? If we're going to start this argument of who really belongs there and who has a claim, we all have a claim. Religious people, and maybe even the world. The Romans have a claim, the Byzantinians have a claim, the Jewish people have a claim, but the Palestinian people represent this polyglot in recent times. So let's talk about the Palestinian dilemma and how we're going to fix it. I just don't know what to do, honestly, because Israel is a beautiful, thriving, growing country now. Yes, at the expense of the freedoms of the Palestinian people. But we cannot deny that Israel is a country now with prosperity, direction, some aspiration, and a political movement that is very contentious, right? We have many people in the left in Israel that do not agree with the movements of the right, just like our country, We have many people in Israel that confront the roots of their country and the origin at what expense, just like our country. Why does our country support an apartheid oppressive state? Because our country is an apartheid oppressive state. So we have a lot of roots there and a lot of soul searching that we all have to do as Americans, as Israelis, and as Palestinians, as a Jewish people, as a Muslim people. There's a lot of soul searching on what we have to do on what human rights mean. What does it mean to be a human and free? And again, I was just saying last time we were talking, you know, democracy is the worst form of government, except it's the best one we have. We have to see a solution through democratic means, and we can't keep pretending that Israel is a democracy. We can't pretend, just as much as Saudi Arabia is not a democracy, Israel is not a democracy, yet we fund their oppressive regime tooth and nail here in America. So what do? What we do is we have to improve our narratives, just like we have to do with racial justice. We have to improve our narratives by educating ourselves on what oppressive systems do to human beings. We almost have to stop talking about the Palestinian problem. I can keep talking about it because I want to say Palestine from now until eternity, because I don't want my culture, my family, and my heritage to be eradicated through the slow genocide that's happening. I will keep calling it Palestinian falafel and Palestinian tabbouleh and Palestinian salad, because I don't want us to be forgotten. Just like the indigenous people here begged us as white people and white passing people to not eradicate their history and their heritage and their union with nature and the land, and we still did. And we're trying to give them a voice today because we seem to understand what a horrible misdeed we did for this planet by eradicating the native and indigenous people of this land. We need to do and see the Palestinian people the same and give them a voice, give them a platform. Don't freak out when someone says, that's not Israeli salad, that's Palestinian salad. Understand why someone is using food to start the narrative. Understand that this is not a religious dilemma. This is a Zionist oppressive argument. Zionism is a colonialist construct. It is not a religion. It is using the Jewish religion as a mechanism to further, just like Hamas and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda is using religion to further a nationalistic claim. Religion is a vehicle to a socio-economic political dilemma. So let's stop letting these people dictate the narrative, because they are extremists. Palestine and Israel is a human rights dilemma, and we all need to come together as Americans and understand how to solve it together by looking at our own country and our own history first.
Thank you, Roxanne. That was great, wonderful. Now we're going to have our last speaker is Ellen Isaacs, and Ellen Isaacs is a retired physician. She's a longtime activist and a member of Jewish Voice for Peace. She is a co-editor of multiracialunity.org blog. She visited Israel and the West Bank 7 times from 2004 to 2015 as a doctor and also as a leader of human rights trips. She has participated in many forums on this topic, ranging from the National American Public Health Association forums to forums at local schools and colleges. Ellen, thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you to both of the previous speakers with whom I agree. And I would like to delve a little further into the concept of one state, which Naya mentioned, because I think it raises some basic issues which are important, not only in Palestine, but in many struggles past, present, and future around the world. Let me say that although I am a member and active in Jewish Voice for Peace in New York City, which is an anti-occupation and anti-Zionist organization, I'm also a Marxist, and what I'm going to say today comes from my Marxist hat, so I don't want JVP to get too offended. During an August 2014 visit to Israel and Palestine, a colleague invited me to a democratic state in Greater Palestine conference in Ramallah. I hadn't really been previously aware of this movement, and I was very excited to hear about it, because on my previous trips, all the Palestinian activists I had met were focused on the two-state solution. And although none of them had any use for Fatah, the political leadership in the West Bank, or Hamas, the leading party in Gaza, they believed that they must have independence first and deal with the leadership and structure of society later. So the One Democratic State movement has been holding regular conferences since 2007, but the idea had been raised for many years before that. The movement is endorsed by many prominent Palestinians and a few Israelis, and it's actually now divided into two factions over differences, which I must say I don't really understand. The two speakers at the first conference I attended were Ilan Pape, an Italian historian, and my friend Dr. Mazen Kumsia, a biology professor in Bethlehem. Pape has been forced to teach outside of Israel since he exposed the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians as the Israeli state was founded. He had gained access to the papers of Ben-Gurion, which described the planned killing or displacement of about 750,000 Palestinians beginning in 1947 and the destruction of over 500 villages. Anyone who hasn't should read his groundbreaking book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, which is not published in Hebrew, by the way. Pape's talk made a convincing case that Israel never intended to allow a Palestinian state, but paid lip service to the idea in order to quell opposition in Palestine and the international community, while continuing to seize land in the West Bank and rain violence down on Gaza. The Israeli intention, Pape said, with which I and many others now agree, has always been to gain control over as much land as possible in historic Palestine while getting rid of as many as possible Palestinians. Dr. Kumsia added that a mass movement uniting Palestinians and anti-occupation Israelis was needed to have any hope of success in achieving a secular multi-ethnic state. To date, this movement has been mostly an intellectual exercise without direct engagement or sponsorship of struggle, which is one of its main weaknesses. Since 2014, there have been more Israeli attacks on Gaza, killing hundreds more civilians, and continued arrests and deprivation, as the previous speakers have described. And it is certain that Israel has no plan to end it. There is much frustration with Fatah and Hamas, but no alternative mass movement with an organized base or strategy other than BDS seems to exist. And BDS is mainly an external strategy. Besides a strategy for resistance, what I think is missing in the one-state movement is any proposal for what kind of state beyond democratic. We live in a single state that's said to be democratic, is one of the richest in the world, is not under occupation or attack, and yet it's obvious that inequality, racism, drastic differences in health, wealth, and well-being exist within our borders. So maybe one state is not enough to ask for. Perhaps by examining and comparing some statistics from the US and Israel-Palestine, we'll see some interesting parallels. In the occupied territories, 40% of all males are or have been in prison, most for political offenses. In the United States, 1/3 of Black men will spend time in prison. In the occupied territories, there is a completely separate military court system with completely different rules for Palestinians than in the Israeli justice system for Jews. In the US, we supposedly have one court system, but Black and Latino men are much more likely to be arrested than whites for similar crimes, receive much harsher penalties, and are much more likely to be killed by the police with impunity. In Israel-Palestine, there is a 10-year difference in life expectancy between Jews and Palestinians. In New York City, there's a 5-year difference between Blacks and whites. The infant mortality is 5 times greater for Palestinians than Jews, and 3 times greater for Black than white New Yorkers. Although the disparities are more severe in Israel-Palestine, they are still very marked in the US of a similar degree of magnitude, despite us having a so-called democratic state with many laws against discrimination, without walls, without internal armed conflict. Israel and occupied Palestine are both capitalist states. Although all classes in Palestine are suffering from the occupation, that does not change the fact that there are classes. This was first glaringly evident to me when I first saw Ramallah in 2005, a city with bustling businesses, luxury restaurants, and beautiful homes, nestled in a country full of impoverished villages and refugee camps. Palestinian basic law specifies that, quote, the economic system in Palestine shall be based on the principles of a free market economy. Since the 1990s, the Fatah, or the Palestinian Authority, has centralized political and economic power in a small group of wealthy businessmen with many ties to Israel and wealthy diaspora capitalists. The Palestinian Development Plan of 2007 encouraged privatization, foreign investment, and service cuts of 21% in the public sector. 78% of the Palestine Stock Exchange is owned by a few rich families, and 25 basic commodities like sugar, oil, cement, and steel are monopolies protected by the PA. So-called reforms also allowed the government to take out interest-bearing loans equaling 50% of the GDP, putting it at the mercy of large firms. And 75% of public employees in the West Bank, the largest sector, are also in debt to these banks, which decreases oppositional activity. Palestine is second to worst in the whole world for the ratio of management to unskilled labor wages. The Palestinian Authority spends over 1/4 of its budget on security, the same amount as on health and education combined, mostly to suppress revolt against Israel. In fact, the PA is such a reliable partner for Israel that they were warned before the Gaza invasion of 2014. All dissent was suppressed before that, but it hasn't worked quite so well lately. So unpopular are the policies of Fatah that Hamas won the electoral victory in 2005, which was more a vote against Fatah than for Hamas. Hamas is a fundamentalist party, also controlled by a small wealthy elite, whose growth was actually encouraged by Israel in the 1980s to decrease the appeal of secular nationalism, much as the United States had done with fundamentalists in Afghanistan to oppose the Soviets. Driven out of the West Bank, but victorious in Gaza, Hamas has been in power there ever since. The Hamas government taxes the people of Gaza at the exorbitant rates of over 60% and pays high salary and sells land only to its own loyalists. They enact a reactionary theocracy or religious state, which is of course very sexist. They use international aid sent to Gaza to enrich themselves and build their military machine, all while workers are starving and suffering from mass unemployment and poverty among the ruins of Gaza, where shortages of water, electricity, and medicine are acute. Hamas leaders live in mansions, dole out privileges to their loyalists, and periodically engage in what I would say are futile military shows which inevitably harmed thousands of civilians, having killed over 5,000 since 2009. This is not to let Israel off the hook for the suffering in Gaza, for clearly Israel is the main villain, but simply to point out that the elected Palestinian politicians do not put the welfare of the masses of their own people first. Of course, Israel is also a very inegalitarian society controlled by a small ruling elite. 18 ruling families have incomes equal to 77% of the national budget and take in 32% of the profits from the largest companies. The income gaps between the 90th and 50th percentiles and the 50th and 10th are the highest in the world. And these differentials are highly race-based. Immigrant workers, mostly from Africa and South Asia, are the worst paid, as are the Palestinians. Dark-skinned Israelis of Arab or African heritage are also low on the scale of wages and services. The General Inequality Index, or GNI, a measure of inequality within a society, shows that the United States and Israel are right next to each other in third and fourth, or fourth and fifth place in the world, depending on the year, for the worst inequality. It's not possible to find graphs which include Palestine, but when inequality has been calculated in the same way, it comes out right next to Israel and the US. Thus, it is evident to me that not only do we need a single non-racist state in all of Greater Palestine, but that such a state would need a new economic structure, a non-capitalist structure, to be able to provide good health, education, jobs, and housing to all of the people and overcome racism. The elites of Palestine and Israel, despite the occupation, already cooperate with each other, or I should say Fatah and Israel, and preside over highly unequal societies, and would be glad to cooperate even more closely in a single state and to continue racism and exploitation. Some Israeli businessmen already openly espouse this position, a single racist capitalist state. So clearly, the creation of a single egalitarian state is not attainable now or anytime soon. But I think the goal provides a framework for current organizing. Just as we strive in the US for multiracial unity, which we need to win significant reforms or build for long-term struggle, so must Arab and Jewish workers unite in Israel and Palestine. They actually did so from the 1920s through the early 1940s in many large militant trade union struggles, when bosses on both sides built nationalism in order to divide them. It's no easy task to envision forms of struggle in Israel and Palestine where repression is so severe. Clearly, the Palestinians cannot win a military victory at this point, but we can rely on the fact that all Palestinians are angry. Many Israelis are too, as the mass support of over 80% of the population for protests about low wages and scarce jobs and housing in 2011 showed. A small minority of Israelis understand that the costs of occupation are responsible for many of these problems, and some object to being part of a fascist enterprise. So one can conceive of tactics that allow masses of Palestinians and their allies to organize. Certainly, checkpoints in the wall are symbols of repression that thousands of both sides could descend upon. As just one idea, would have to include Israelis to avoid the horrible recent repression. But in general, the lesson is that everywhere we must rely on rank and file leadership and participation rather than politicians, sellout religion, union leaders, or NGOs. When we engage in whatever immediate struggles we are fighting, we must reiterate and win people to see that a profit-based system which relies on racist super exploitation can ultimately not provide good or equal quality of life or services, be it in advanced capitalist countries or in Israel, Palestine. I think whatever country we're talking about, what is needed is a system run by and for working people, where production is for need and not profit, and where racism and sexism are banned. And so there you have it, my more radical proposal. And now I guess we can
Good to start the video. Oh. Thank you very much, Ellen. And I think we have some time for some questions. Let's see. You know that Barbara Walker wanted to provide some information. Barbara, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I am here.
Did you want to say something?
Yes, I have, it's not providing information, it's really asking a question of Dr. Isaacs. Since there exists a state, an actual state of Palestine, the US has not recognized it, therefore it's not a member of the UN, but it is a permanent observer. And, well, thinking of two questions at the same time, would that serve as a base for the state that you are describing?
Well, I don't think you can really say there is a state of Palestine, because Palestine exists completely under the military thumb and control of Israel, and without hardly any of its own economic resources or water. So we really have to be realistic and say it's an occupied territory. But the point I was trying to make is that although Palestinians are horribly oppressed, those politicians that are in power in both, with the support of very little of the population, I think surveys usually say that 7% of the people support Fatah and maybe up to 30% support Hamas. Those are very rough figures, but it's, you know, below half for both of them combined. That to say that a state that those people would be in charge of would not be to the advantage of the majority of Palestinians.
Does anybody
It's
else
hard to know.
The other
Yeah, it's hard to know what qualifies a state, right? These days, the UN recognizes the state of Palestine, and the majority of the world, of course, not Israel and not America, agree with the United Nations. But what kind of authorizing and validating body is the UN these days? So what does that mean? Does Palestine, and to, you know, Ellen Isaac's point, you know, we don't have a thriving economy. Gaza is shut down. There's no importing, no exporting. The children barely have access to the shoreline, the beautiful shoreline that was just, just eradicated, basically, for any source of income and access. And then the West Bank, again, as I described, we don't really have, the Palestinian Authority is a sort of a militia, if you will. Does a militia mean that there's a state, or there's no government? So it's hard to talk about the state of Palestine in the way the UN wants the rest of the world to acknowledge it. And we really have to ask those really hard questions. Now, Palestine exists in the hearts and the minds of the Palestinian people and its allies. So it's a state of mind. It's got a heritage. It's got an ancestry. Like I was trying to say, we have a culture. We have traditions. We have land. We have stories. We have anecdotes. We have history books. There's an expression we say in Arabic, it literally means they took it fully furnished. What it implies is that there was a thriving government and society, even though the sick man of the Ottoman Empire was deteriorating, there was still a thriving system there. Can we go back to that system? Of course not. But we can't keep denying that it didn't exist. There was a thriving economic and body that governed three religions in a relatively state of peace. Palestine was probably one of the best examples of a, of a republic, if you will. But you know, I'm not going to go into World War II and what the Ottoman Empire did and what nationalism did. And I think the other speakers did a phenomenal job to explore that history. But we really have to analyze what does a statehood mean in the Western world, because in the Middle East and in the East, we already understand Palestine as a state in our heart.
Amnea, did you want to say something?
No, I mean, I think the other speakers covered it really well. There's definitely other questions that I didn't address from earlier. So I don't know if we want to bounce back to any of those.
Okay, I just want to give Lori Weintraub an opportunity to say something. Lori, are you there?
Can you hear me? I don't know. Can you
Yes.
hear me? Yeah, I don't know why I can't see myself. Okay. Yeah, I just want to make very brief comments because I think this is an important event where both Roxanne and Amnia, did I say your name right, had a chance to really share their perspective. And I think, you know, that was the main purpose of this event. And I think that that was achieved. I had earlier reached out to Peace Action just to express my own views, my personal views. I'm not representing any institutions, although I do teach on the subject of genocide. I personally don't agree that it's ethnic cleansing, genocide, apartheid, or even Jim Crow. I mean, I have, you know, different arguments for why I would disagree with that. There's 45 Muslim majority countries. In those countries, there's almost no Jews, 100 Jews, whereas in Israel, 17% of the population is Muslim. They're represented now in the actual functioning government with 4 seats. There's another 6 seats in the current government 10 days ago that are being held by, you know, left-wing Israeli parties that are very committed to a 2-state solution. I think we're really in the middle of a transition. And I think it's really important on Staten Island itself, where there's such a strong interfaith community, to keep open the dialogue between different groups. And that's why I actually don't know well either of the 2 speakers. So I'm very glad to hear their perspective. And I was very happy to hear that I could agree with several of the things they said about how important it is to value history, how important it is to recognize that Jews are in multiple political parties. I think it is important. There was a question someone asked about, you know, how do Jews justify this in the Bible? But to mention there's actually DNA evidence that even Ashkenazi Jews are something like 55% Middle Eastern, and obviously the North African Mediterranean Jews who have all these food traditions in common with the Palestinians, that obviously their DNA is going to be a lot more Middle Eastern because they're Mediterranean, and, you know, they lived in Algeria or Tunisia their whole lives. So just, I think as long as we can recognize that there's different perspectives on this conflict and we can go forward in a dialogue to promote peace with this, you know, awareness, I don't think I feel a need today to list specific facts. Only, you know, just this one fact that, you know, if in 1948 there was 1.5 million Muslims and today there's 7 million Muslims, it's really hard to make an argument for genocide, in my opinion. But even for apartheid, particularly within Israel itself, the occupied territories are a little bit different. So it's not my event. I really don't want to say any more than that, just that I appreciate the fact that it represents an attempt to move forward, you know, cooperatively with neighbors learning from each other.
Neil Frumkin, you had a comment or a question?
Yes, thank you. In light of, you know, just the events in this country over the last year and a half of struggle against racial inequities, murders, economic inequality, it seems to me that the struggle in Israel/Palestine begs the question of what kind of movement has to be built to build a truly just society, and not only there, but throughout the world. I mean, I think people have different views of what they would like to see. And I know that, you know, literally hundreds of thousands and millions of people in my lifetime have been involved in, you know, just titanic struggles. There was some talk about South Africa where, you know, how many people gave their lives to end the apartheid regime there, and you know, what type of society are they living in today? Is it what people fought for and hoped for? And the question that I have basically is, what kind of movement has to be built in Israel/Palestine to change the conditions on the ground there and build a truly just society? Thank you.
Can I respond to Lori's question? She posted something in the chat, and also, yeah, she just recently spoke. So, well, let me address first what she said in the chat. So as far as because I think it's important to understand that, so Israel has recently, their government has undergone a very strange coalition where, so the new prime minister, Naftali Bennett, will be prime minister for 2 years. And then the centrist, Yair Lapid, will take over in another 2 years. Yair Lapid is not a leftist. That's a really important thing to understand. He's been quoted as saying, we need to get the Palestinians out of our lives. What we have to do is build a high wall and get them out of our sight. So this is what's considered a centrist in Israel. So if anything, because I'm hearing, you know, seeing left-wing Israeli parties, the left wing is a very diminishing faction, in fact, in Israeli politics. The right wing has become overtly more racist, overtly more strong. I mean, the level of pogroms that have been happening on the streets in Israel are pretty much going completely unchecked by Israeli defense forces, by the Israeli police. It's basically state-sanctioned violence, you know, settler violence. So, and also, as far as to respond to the point of, you know, well, it doesn't look like ethnic cleansing, it doesn't look like apartheid. There are 65 discriminatory laws for Palestinian citizens of Israel. And those are just the people who are citizens of Israel. Literally every single, I mean, Human Rights Watch wrote, like I said, a 213-page report describing apartheid conditions in occupied territories and within Israel itself. Palestinian citizens of Israel still go through an entirely separate legal system. So there's kind of this facade, and that's something a lot of folks will say, is, oh, Palestinians have equal rights if they're citizens of Israel. That is definitely not the case. That's very much like saying that Black Americans have equal rights in the United States. You know, we live in a system that oppresses Black people. Israelis live in a system that oppresses Palestinians. And there can be no talk of peace until that reality is acknowledged. I think it's a very unfortunate thing to try to diminish the experiences of Palestinians who are speaking about the injustice that they are living under. It is very much akin to gaslighting, and we need to really be clear that that's exactly what it is. As far as the question about if Jews could live within an Arab state, or, you know, without the Jewish majority in the West Bank and other places, you know, in a one-state solution, there's something that's called pinkwashing that I want folks to understand, that a lot of times something that Zionist messaging will do is it will co-opt the struggle for LGBTQ liberation and say, well, look at those racist Arabs and how they treat Jews. So this kind of justifies why Arabs have no rights. Well, we need Israel because it's the only democracy in the Middle East. You know, it's the only place where, you know, LGBTQ people are affirmed and are, you know, these are struggles. An LGBTQ Palestinian still has to go through a checkpoint to get from one town to another. Apartheid still exists for LGBTQ Palestinians. So as far as that question about, you know, LGBTQ oppression within an Israeli state or within a future Palestinian state, I think that that's a very dangerous, I guess, distraction from what is really the issue here, which is human rights, which affects both straight and gay and lesbian and transgender Palestinians. It does not, you know, apartheid doesn't make that distinction. So I think we really need to make it clear that Israel is not a democracy. It is, apartheid states are not democracies. And if we're still at the place of denying that this is an apartheid state, we will not see peace. That is the first reality that needs to be acknowledged. So that is my answer to that question.
Do I have a chance to respond briefly also?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. I really appreciate Lori's comments, and in the spirit of conversation and dialogue, I really appreciate it because it is she raised common arguments that I've heard many times. I'd like to counter argue that these are false equivalencies. Let me explain. To say when you're comparing Israel to Muslim countries that do not acknowledge Jews, number one, I'd like to ask you, what is a Muslim country? I don't really know what that definition is. Number two, you are also making this a religious argument. And I think many of us are offering the contention that this is not a religious argument. And then number three, the argument you made about how could it be ethnic cleansing when there's so many more so many more Muslims in the world than there was in the time of the occupation. And again, I would ask you to look at the Palestinian demographic, which is multi-racial, multi-religious. And I am telling you that my family was kicked off the land, murdered and killed and imprisoned and tortured. So these are my counter arguments to why I believe that when we look at Israel, we should think and compare it to other democracies and not countries in the Middle East, which are very poor standards of human rights and democracy. Israel is not the best one of them. Israel is a lot like the rest of them, suffering similar signs of oppression and human rights catastrophes. So let's not look at the Muslim and Jewish lens of these countries in the Middle East. Let's look at the liberation and freedom and equal representation lens, because we are Americans.
Jennifer Hyman, you had a number of questions. So do you want to say something?
I think Jennifer said she had to leave.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. John Lawrence, did you want to say something?
I had a question in regards to Palestine. One of the speakers said that neither Hamas or Fatah is very popular. I was wondering what holds back a more populist group from forming and representing the majority in Palestine.
I can speak from some of the people on the ground. It's been really difficult to organize politically because of the oppressive system. Hamas and Palestinian Authority or Fatah were set up as proxy places of order. One of the biggest challenges as a Palestinian-American is watching how difficult it is to organize politically and socially in Palestine. We have some really amazing ally movements from people like Miko Peled and other organizations with Israeli allies. And that's where I see a lot of the opportunity, because they understand how oppressive the system is in Gaza. Hamas really started out as like a social services network, and they gained popularity by giving people food and clean water and electricity. And then it became more and more of a religious mantra. So think about like that opportunity they had to organize that was used then to, for political and extremist means. It is very difficult. Think about what it's like to organize for social justice here in America, and just magnify that problem with lack of infrastructure, lack of mobility, lack of access. And then, as you can see, lack of narrative, right? We are constantly being compared to Muslim countries as Palestinians. And the poor example of human rights I still don't know what a Muslim country is. Muslims are as diverse as Jews are and as Christians are. We come from a different background. So how are we comparing? These are very difficult conditions to organize when we don't even have the right narrative sometimes. If anyone has any references or resources from the panelists here of successful grassroots organization, I'd love to hear them. But what I have seen is more like ad hoc, immediate, like putting out fires literally, and games of whack-a-mole, and just being displaced constantly. That's what I see grassroots groups do.
Ellen, did you want to respond to that?
Thanks. Yeah, I think definitely one problem, as Roxanne said, is there's tremendous repression. As soon as anybody does anything in Palestine, they're in jail and they can be held without charges indefinitely. and arrested and tortured. And so it is very, very difficult to organize. There is a history of militant organizing, as I said, back before statehood. A lot of it was very left-wing, very communist, but unfortunately, a lot of it devolved into nationalism and kind of died as a force. And other groups have risen up, like PFLP, which have ended up in the sort of dead end of international terrorism, like capturing airline flights and stuff, which really doesn't lead anywhere. I think you have a lot of people, especially in the West Bank, the more pro-liberal democratic types, like Omar Barghouti, involved in the BDS movement. But I think the idea that a boycott is going to overthrow the power structure in Israel and lead to a better outcome is really an illusion. And this is partly an answer to what Neil said. I think because the BDS movement often talks about using South Africa as a model, but I think, there are some very big fallacies in that. One is to forget that there was a huge organized militant and large and partly violent movement in South Africa that went on for a long time, which is one of the things that pressured the apartheid government to have talks. And another thing that really pressured them to get together and talk with the ANC was the ANC was willing to give up all its economic demands. Naomi Klein has a very good chapter about this in the Shock Doctrine. And what she points out is that they basically demanded civil rights, an end to pass laws, things like that. But they didn't demand economic equality. They didn't demand that the large capitalist enterprises and mines, et cetera, be dismantled and a whole new economic system be put in place. And so you ended up having black bosses running the local offices of large international companies, and you ended up with spectacles like the black government striking black miners in the back. And you have 20 years after liberation, that only 10% of land has been redistributed since 1994. That white South Africans still earn 5 times as much as blacks, that 50% of the population has no wealth at all, and that Black men still have an 18-year shorter life expectancy than white men, 17 years after the end of apartheid. So this is really not a goal to emulate because they didn't really change the economic basis of society. And also, I think Israel is much more important as a military and economic base to the United States than South Africa was to the Western world, which is another reason that a boycott is not going to overturn it. The BDS movement has been very valuable as an educational tool in schools and unions all over the world, getting people to talk about the issue and educate themselves and bring some pressure, but it's not going to overthrow the state.
No, Sarah Rachel Walters, did she have a question?
Alejandro Latorre.
Alejandro Latorre, would you like to say something?
No.
No?
I didn't have any questions. I did put some comments up,
Okay.
and I'm just trying to hoping that if there's any way we need to bridge resources, I guess, together between peace groups in the United States and peace groups in Israel and Palestine. And I mentioned also with Israeli Jewish people of color, so they're on the bottom of the list also. And there's a lot of racial hatred among Jews and Israeli Jews between Ashkenazic and Mizrahi and Sephardim. And a lot of people don't even know that. So I'm trying to see where we can make connections. I don't know. Just throwing that out there.
Okay. Did Linda Cohen want to say something?
I have a question, Jack is asking.
Okay.
I put a question in the chat because I was actually listening to a J Street, somebody was being interviewed for breaking the silence. And I was watching that before I came on here. And they were talking about getting more electeds to take a position on ending the occupation. And I was thinking about how, I don't know how it is today, but a few years ago, I had noticed council members in New York City Council would take the free trips that were offered to Israel, and a lot of them would not go to the occupied territories. And I thought that that was, you know, wasted because they weren't able to have a dialogue and, you know, further the conversation. So I was just wondering what we could do to maybe pressure more of them to visit the occupied territories and to speak to people on both sides.
Linda, I would love to respond to that and bring it close to home. You know, that scenario happened with Assemblyman Charles Paul, if you remember. Assemblyman Charles Paul was on a state-sanctioned trip to Israel, and he tweeted and Facebooked about it, talked about all of the great bridge building he was doing with Israel. And many Muslims here came again, and these are not Muslim Palestinians, these are Muslim allies of Palestine. Many Muslim allies outside of Staten Island kind of were upset with Assemblyman Fall, not because he went to Israel proper, but he didn't discuss the occupation at all, as if it wasn't there. And to some of the points that were made here, yes, you're right. It's an opportunity to have talked about the occupation, and it could have been used for this trip, this state-sanctioned trip could have been used for good. And again, I want to stress again, it's not Muslim Palestinians that objected to the trip, it's Muslim allies. Now, I wanted to say something about the last question about what we can do about this moral dilemma of within the Jewish community and the sort of racial profiling within the religious and the Jewish community. Can I go back to that really briefly, if I could? I'll try to be super brief. I just love that question. And all I could tell you is how I think about it. Certainly I am not a Jewish woman, right? But you know, there's a kinship with many of my Jewish friends and Israeli friends. We have a deep kinship, and we have a lot of very strong similarities in our cultures and traditions. I was raised a Muslim, so there's a lot of similarities with my Israeli friends as a Palestinian, and there's a lot of similarities as a person who's raised as a Muslim with my Jewish friends. The way I think about it, and I don't know, I offer anyone to challenge this, is there's the political dilemma, there's the social dilemma, which the social dilemma involves the human rights dilemma, the humanistic dilemma, and then there's the religious dilemma. Let's put the religious dilemma on the side. I think when we solve the political dilemma, it becomes a vehicle for our morals and values as social beings. The politics and democracy is a vehicle to move the questions that we're asking, like how do we reconcile all these different groups that hate each other? The political mechanism the political question and solution need to provide the mechanism for the others. Sure, can the social solution come first? Of course it can, but where have you seen that work well in history? I don't know. Can the religious institutions be the model for the political and the social? I'll say it again. Where have we seen that be successful in history? It's usually the politics can be a unifier, and then the other two will have to come later. So I recommend that we all, and again, I don't say democracy as a synonym to capitalism. I'm talking about the form of equal representation in a republic. And so that's what I would offer.
Just to respond to Linda, to her question about, you know, pressuring our elected officials to visit occupied territories, to even take on the Palestinian cause literally at all. So there will come a point I just really want this to be understood in history, where we will understand that visiting Israel and not visiting occupied Palestine is like visiting the Jim Crow South and not seeing how people were living. I truly believe that one day we will see a free Palestine, because people are meant to be free. People are meant to be free. What people are living under goes against human nature. It's not natural. This occupation will end, and one day I believe that we will all look back on this and be very disturbed at the silence of our elected officials, but also the silence of our fellow progressives. There's a saying, progressive except for Palestine, EP, progressive except for Palestine. And even just in terms of our recent mayoral election, there was only one candidate who called Israel an apartheid state. Even the most progressive, Maya Wiley, said she was opposed to BDS. I think that
We need to start wrapping up.
Sorry?
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. You know, at some point, I do think that representation matters. I think that having Arab and Muslim people in government matters, but I don't think it's the be all end all either, because even some of the Muslim people, you know, leaders in Congress have even been against BDS. So representation alone, I don't think it's a be all end all. I don't think that that's completely the answer. I think it helps, but I think, again, like we need to normalize the push for a free Palestine and make it less taboo, and make it clear that it is racist to deny the fact that there's an apartheid. It is racist to deny people's reality. That's like saying, that's like saying that Black Americans live in an equal America. That's a racist thing to say. It is racist to say that. And one day we will look very differently upon this time and realize how, you know, like we'll have a better perspective for the reality that we are currently living in. And they say hindsight is 20/20. Well, we like to think that one day that you know, that we stood on the right side of history. At least that's how I want to feel. And yeah, we want to feel that we stood on the right side of history. People say, well, what would I do if I lived, you know, during the time of Jim Crow? If I lived during the time of the you're living in it. What are you going to do? And I think we can pressure our Congress people, our representatives, but I don't think it's enough. I think we need to take back the narrative, if anything. We need to share these voices because they are not mainstream. What we're hearing tonight is not, these are not things that we can easily say. These are things that people lose their jobs over. I had to send a message to a teacher friend.
Very scary.
Yes, I had to send a message to a friend of mine who was sharing about Palestine. Be careful. They can fire you over this for even saying the word Palestine. We need to break the taboo. It's like kind of similar to like the McCarthy era. Oh, you know, I mean, look at what they're doing to one of the main activists named Nordine Kiswani, who is, she's organized a lot of the protests in New York City. And there are people, because she's a CUNY law student, who are trying to get her expelled from the school. So again, like, it's not just, we need to make this less taboo. That needs to be understood, that that's a racist position to stand against Palestinian human rights. It is a racist position.
Mike here, did you want to say something? No. Jacqueline Baker.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. I think there is, you know, I said what I really wanted to say in that chat. It's sort of a paraphrase from George Jackson. I mean, there's some differences of opinions here, but I do agree with what Neil just said. That and what Roxanne was also saying, that there is a reality of what's going on in Gaza. I mean, people are dying by the day. You know, people are being butchered. People are living half-lives. And if we ignore that reality, we are going to be on the wrong side of history. As far as all the solutions, I think we need to put aside some of our differences and just grasp that particular reality. And, you know, I spent a lot of my youth fighting about what was going on in South Africa. You know, what's going on in South Africa today does not make me perfectly happy at all. I mean, there's still extreme poverty. You know, there's big differences between the classes, particularly between the poorest of Black people there and what's going in, you know, the white world there too. But I think we can't give up with what's going on right now and try to unite as much as possible around that. Not ignore it and really listen to what's being said about what happens to people, particularly, you know, educators that lose their jobs just trying to speak the truth about the reality that's going on in Palestine today. I'll leave it there.
Jacqueline, did you listen?
Yes, me, yeah. I wanted to make one comment and one question to Ms. Isaacs. My comment is that we have to become extremely active politically because Hakeem Jeffries, who is the congressman from New York, made a statement that Israel should be the 6th borough of New York City. So that, you know, we need to push the politicians not to send the police to Israel for training, not to watch what contracts are being made with Israeli. There's a lot of contracts that the city is making with Israel in terms of supplying weapons to police, in infrastructure, lots of things. I was shocked when I was looking them up, but I think we need to be alert to that very much. So that's my comment. My question is to Ms. Isaacs. Doing some research, I run a show on Sunday afternoons called Zoom Palestine, where I interview people that are active in the Palestine situation. I lived from 2007 till very recently in Jordan, teaching as a professor at NYIT there. And I now I'm not being hired because I've been pro-Palestine. I think I'm not getting classes anymore because of my position on Palestine. But what some of my research for my program, I discovered that in the early days of Israel, the communists were a communist party was a place of unity for both the Muslims, Arabs, Palestinians, and Jewish immigrants. So that the early days of Israel, the Communist Party actually was this petri dish of Jews and Palestinians politically. And I was wondering, Ms. Isaacs, if you know if there's anything similar to that happening now in Israel on the left.
Yeah, so 2 points about communist parties. Yes, there was a strong left in Israel early on. Many, people came from Eastern Europe and Russia, or been involved in booms, and there was a conflict between Zion nationalism and communism. And I think, unfortunately, the Soviet Union had a great deal of influence, and they devolved into very nationalist policies by the 30s. And so the communist parties in Israel and Palestine really divided along nationalist lines to the detriment of both groups. I put a reference in the chat, which is to 2 long articles about history and class struggle, which goes into a lot of that in more detail. There are some very small left-wing organizing efforts in Israel that unite Israeli Palestinians and Jews, but they're really, they're very small at this point. And, so I agree that we should nurture them, but they have a long way to go. In terms of politicians, I just want to say that there are probably a few politicians here and there with good ideas about Israel-Palestine, but I think we have to realize that Israel is of tremendous import to the United States. As Biden said the other day, if it wasn't there, we'd have to invent it. It's our nuclear base in that part of the world. It's our way of controlling radical movements, of controlling what goes on in terms of oil and being a bridge against Iran. And it's also as you said, it trains our police forces, it creates weapons to control urban populations. And it's also, we shouldn't forget, been a convenient place to carry on struggles, supportive struggles, like the Contras in Nicaragua or Iran or in South Africa, where it wouldn't be possible for the United States to overtly be sending troops to support right-wing movements, but they've managed to use Israel to do it. So not that the United States in any way loves Jews. If ever there were to be an Arab Spring that actually created more progressive and maybe pro-American founts of Arab power in the Middle East, and it was necessary to get rid of Israel, I'm sure the US would do it in a moment if they had a more acceptable substitute. And I do think there are many people that think that Israel should stop behaving so disastrously toward Palestinians because it does create backlash, which they don't like. So not all American politicians want this huge degree of apartheid oppression to continue, but that's because they want to be able to have a more reliable and less controversial ally in Israel. So we need to build, as you said, a mass rank and file movement here, around the world, and among Israel and Palestinians.
Debbie, this is Sally. I just want to do a time check. We're getting close to 9 o'clock, and there's somebody entered the waiting room, but I'm assuming that it'd be kind of late for them to join this discussion. So I just want to do a time check. How much further are we going to be on so I can handle the waiting room?
This is Jack. I'd like to say just a few words quickly.
Debbie, you're muted.
Okay. Jack, why don't you say what you have to say, and then maybe we can have like each of our speakers say a minute or two, and then we'll wrap up. Unless there's somebody else who really feels that they had something important that they wanted to ask, or they can raise their hands and we'll recognize them. But I think it is kind of time to start wrapping it up. So
Okay,
Jack?
I'll be as brief as possible. You know, this conflict's been going on since the end of World War II, over 75 years, and it's very complicated to come to a resolution without, you know, somebody with the UN and all these countries getting involved to make sure. But I was shocked at two statistics, that 7.5 million Palestinians are refugees. My question is, how many of these refugees have become citizens, say, of Western Europe and North America? And the other question is 97% of the water supply in Gaza is contaminated. It's not fit to drink. There's an aquifer under Lebanon and Israel and probably into the Gaza that can supply water. Why isn't there an international effort to get water, get hospitalization, education, everything that's needed? Because the people have to be extremely angry and unhappy living there. And then my last thing is that the mention was Ashkenazi. The Ashkenazis are not Middle Eastern. Their ethnic, their genetic makeup, and you can check this out, their genetic makeup comes from Central Italy. Because there was Jews that left during the Byzantine era, and they intermarried with Italian women, and they became mostly Italian. And then when they moved up to Germany, they stayed amongst themselves. But when they spread into Poland and Russia, there was some Eastern European in them. But Ashkenazi, look historically, they're not from the Middle East. The ancient Palestinians 2,000 years ago, more closely related. I think the ethnic group is the Druze that live there. They're mostly related to them. So the Ashkenazi are mostly a European group, just to set that straight. But I'm really curious about the infrastructure in Gaza and the 7.5 million that are refugees. How many of them did become citizens in the countries that they went to? So thank you. This is a great discussion.
Jack, such good questions, such good pragmatic questions. None of us refugees are citizens of Israel. If we are, we may have some Palestinian Jewish lineage and access to Israel in that way. Otherwise, I have the luxury and the privilege of having an American passport, and I have an American husband who's not Arab or Palestinian. So I can come and go into Israel. I don't know what it would be like for someone like me to claim citizenship of Israel if I wanted to. I may have some access with my husband's paternal side, who is Ukrainian Jew, 1/4, I believe. I may have some access that way. I would have had more access if my husband's maternal side was part Jewish and he was married to me. So there's the complication in all of that when you try to define identity in a state citizenry. The aquifer you're talking about, just to be super, super brief, some Gazans do get access to where the access is on and off. From what I'm talking about firsthand accounts of friends and friends of family, not like publications and journalistic access. So I'm just going to tell you what I hear. It's very hard for Gazans to tell the community at large that they have been thwarted access to the aqueduct, because Israel has claimed that those tunnels and that access is used by Hamas as a terrorist organization to smuggle in arms. So it gets shut down immediately. As soon as you say Hamas, as soon as you say terrorism, everything's shut down. So those folks in Gaza become hostages of this narrative. I know firsthand that those tunnels that Israel said Hamas built to smuggle arms were tunnels that were used to access into Egypt, as well as Syria, as well as Tel Aviv. Those tunnels were initially used for wheat and grain. I'm sure there were arms also sent, but those were lifelines for the people of Gaza. So of course the water is going to be cut off. And then there's the explicit claims to only sustain Gazans on a certain percentage of calories and diet. So there is a state effort. And this is for the person that talked about, I don't understand why this is Jim Crow or called Jim Crow or apartheid. There is a concerted effort to restrict the nutrition value and food access and clean water into Gaza. And it's documented by the UN.
Okay, well, I think we have like 3 minutes. So I wanna, am I mute?
Yes.
No, I'm not. So I wanna thank everybody that, can you hear me? Yeah.
We hear you, Debbie.
Okay. I want to thank everybody who participated today, everybody who asked a question, who made a comment in the chat. I want to thank all our wonderful speakers. I mean, today I learned so much about the situation, and every speaker gave a passionate and informative analysis of and viewpoint of their viewpoint of the problem. And I think that you know, we all need to step up and try to organize and to resolve the situation in Palestine and Israel in an equitable and just way. So I don't know if any of our speakers want to say something briefly, but it would be wonderful if they did, and I just want to thank them. Okay. Is that it?
That's it.
I can tell you how much I appreciate this forum and the panelists who spoke, and I appreciate Peace Action and you, Debbie. Last parting words, brief words, listen to the targeted and affected groups.
And now you can get out of your car. Okay, so bye-bye. Thank you, Amneya. Thank you, Ellen, for, I hope that you enjoyed participating, and I hope that this is a beginning of people stepping up and organizing and discussing this with their friends and neighbors. And I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything, or I think it's good night.